Assalamualaikum and very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining us in this deep dive workshop number 10 entitled Carbon Capture and Storage Solutions Towards Sustainable Growth of Asia. My name is Aizal, there's a small correction there, from Strategic Research of Petronas. And I am honored to be here today to be your moderator. Let me begin by thanking and congratulating SEDA for successfully organizing this particular summit this year. Since the beginning of the summit yesterday, we have heard the high-level pledges, commitment, and also aspirations of our government leaders, industry leaders, and also our thought leaders on achieving net zero GHG emission by 2050. So it's not an easy target to deliver. And in fact, this morning, the CEO of International Hydropower Association reminded all of us that we only left with about 10,000 days before we have to achieve all this. In fact, it's 10,350 days. And I wonder who's counting. All right. Nevertheless, in this particular session, we will be treated by to listening to our highly respected experts in this field to discuss how we will be able to work on a feasible solution to give us a chance to get a step closer to the aspiration of delivering energy solutions and in sustainable manner. CCS, or carbon capture and storage, is one of the most promising current solution for decarbonization of hydrocarbon today. Is part of many innovations needed towards managing carbon emissions and energy transitions. Without delivering CCS, we will find it a bit more challenging to deliver cleaner energy solutions such as blue hydrogen, for example. So we have to get this thing work today. This is a very important topic. So therefore, we are proud to fill a lineup of esteemed panelists to share their expert views on the role of CCS in accelerating sustainable energy from the perspective of technology, from business model, and also government policies. I will introduce each of our panelists prior to their talk. Each panelist will be given 10 minutes. I repeat, up to 10 minutes, gentlemen. This will be followed by a group question and answer for about 10 to 15 minutes. So, ladies and gentlemen, please keep all the questions coming for later. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, let me introduce you to our first speaker, Encik Emri Hisham Yusof. He is our Senior General Manager of Carbon Management in Petronas. He has built his colorful career in petroleum engineering and has been country head for Petronas in Myanmar and also Mexico. He will be setting the scene of our conversation today on CCS as we want to understand some of the key projects globally, and also we want to talk about whether it's technically and, my favorite, commercially feasible for us to actually get CCS as our solution today. So, buenos dias, Senor Emri, the floor is yours.
Okay, buenos tardes, yes. Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Aizan, and good day to everyone. I'm actually glad to be here to at least to introduce to you some awareness of what is CCS, carbon capture and storage. When we talk about carbon capture or storage, usually people say it's only oil and gas things that people do. Actually, it's beyond that. We had a partnership with a lot of companies. Many of them are actually emitters. And let me share with you what we do. What is CCS? And how does CCS applicable to especially Malaysia? But then if I continue with what our SVP of corporate strategy yesterday, Cik Mazwin mentioned, Petronas have actually gone into these decarbonizations for some time, since 2013. For upstream alone, if you look at the way that we do decarbonizations, this is looking at our venting, flaring, our combustions. We have actually up to this year, we're taking 2013 number, we have actually reduced about close to 40% of our emissions already. So this is journey, is a long journey, and now we are looking at CCS. So what is CCS? So you can see behind me, usually people say from emitters down. I move from the storage going that side lah. So what is CCS? Actually is you must have the storage first. So what are the storage? It's actually is place there where you can seal the CO2 when you inject into to come just like any tank. But we are using a natural tank here, and this is called in Malaysia or in any parts of the world. This is actually is either your depleted field, depleted oil and gas fields, mainly gas usually, or you can also look for saline aquifer. So sometimes they are reservoir which is water with and actually deeper than 1,000 meter, and they have proper seals so that you make sure that you can actually inject CO2 into that reservoir. So that is one. So you create a pore. There's a pore space there. You are actually creating space for your carbon. So when you go to the emitters, I'll go straight to the emitters first. So you look at the emitters. I think that is where the capture will be. The emitters can be not just Petronas, but can be any industry player here, either outside of oil and gas. There are many emitters here. So the emitters, what they'll do is actually is to capture this CO2, and there are technology that for you to capture this CO2. However, it depends on the process of each of the emitters plant. So the thing is what's come out from your plant, because the thing is your pressure at the time is actually quite low. You need to actually capture and boost back for you to actually inject. And then in between there is what we call the transportations. So if you are within very close to the storage, you probably don't need this ship or vessel, but you probably can actually pipe it. But in the case of long haul, between countries to country, or even from one side of the country to another side of the country, you probably need this liquefied CO2 carrier. So when you look at liquefied CO2 carrier, there is already in the world, they are available, but it's actually at a very small capacity, and it's used for F&B. The CO2 that you use for your sodas, your Coca-Cola, your Sprite, all that CO2. So it's a small scale, but we are talking about a big scale here. And it's almost like your LNG carrier, but the thing is we cannot use the LNG carrier because of the different temperature and pressure that you need to maintain to keep it in liquid form. Then you send to the onshore gathering terminal. When it goes to terminal, and we send this liquid to inject into the reservoir offshore. Here we show offshore because this is what Malaysia have. Mainly it's actually offshore sites. Probably they are in other countries, they probably have some onshore sites, but in Malaysia mainly it's actually offshore. So I put a note there. If you can actually store 1 million ton per annum of CO2, is almost like equal of you planting of around 17 million trees per year, because the amount of CO2 that you can actually inject. Here are some of the global CCS project. This is not extensive. There are many others, but we just choose some. You can see some are already running. For example, like Quest, Metronova there is already running. There are project currently also have taken FID, something like Northern Lights. Gorgon also is already running. So some of project are doing. You can see one is actually is with Petronas. we are doing this Kasawari, and it's actually for Kasawari. Just to share with you, we are capturing about 71 million ton of CO2 to be injected into one of the limited reservoir in M1. So that's how much of CO2 that we are trying to capture from Kasawari. The project is about to be sanctioned soon. I think maybe 1 or 2 months, and we are expected to start injection by 2026. Same goes to we also have another one project which is actually I think together with HAS, Syaragadi and HAS in Cakrawala, trying to also capture the CO2 and inject into the reservoir. I think that sanction also is expected in January or in Q1 next year. So if you look at for Petronas ourselves, we never said that we running away from oil and gas. Of course, we will be more gassy than oily, so it will be more gassy. you see that. But for us to continue to produce gas, we also need to have because the gas that we discover is going to be with some CO2, and to be responsibly to operate this more responsibly, we have to come up with also the storage. So similar like what we are doing here in Kasawari, and you will hear soon that there are other projects also will go through the same process. So I'll go back to Malaysia. I'll look at the circle. This is not done by Petronas. This is actually done by Global CCS Institute. They have actually looked at how much capacity that Malaysia has or Southeast Asia has, and you can see Malaysia have about 13.3 billion or 13.3 gigaton of CO2 space that you can actually offer for us to capture CO2. Malaysia don't require that much. Malaysia up to even 2050 probably require about 700-800 million ton. So we have a lot of to also. If we are not doing anything for Malaysia, actually this is something that Malaysia can actually offer. We can also help in terms of the global climate of offering space or pore space for us to actually store CO2 for the region. So Malaysia can actually become a regional hub here for climate change even for Malaysia to go to net zero by 2050, you look at the we do need CCS too. I think if you look at the number in 2004, our emission at the time was not so large. Actually, we are negative actually. But because we become industrialized and then our emissions is actually more now, we do have some volume after we do all the things that we want to do on renewable whatever as per plan. Unless we actually pick up on other things, we still have some volume that we actually need CCS for us to achieve the Aspire 2050 net carbon zero. So if you look at this, what does it bring to Malaysia in terms of social economy? Actually, there's a lot of value for Malaysia. If we can actually do this, it's not just Malaysia can also be the climate change champion for the region through CCS. There will be a lot of jobs that we created. You can see we are not saying that we are going to kill one industry, change one industry to another industry. We're going to sustain this industry. For us to sustain industry, we need to create this new industry. And creating this industry also open up, like what Cik Aizal mentioned, to spin off to other businesses. Now comes the blue hydrogens, the other requirement of CO2 capture. So I think that is what we are looking at here. And you look at by 2036, I think probably you heard many times already in the session. By 2026, there's going to be CBAM in Europe, right? It's going to impact even the existing export of Malaysia. The existing is not talking about future. The things that we've been exporting is going to affect it also because of the low carbon requirement of the Europeans. So I'm not saying CCS is the only one, but ECS is probably one of the considerations for the technology that you need to consider to capture. So there's a lot of things that we need. Actually, we need these collaborations between industries and government, as well as government to government, for us to establish a sustainable and viable market for CCS, to create this conducive investment for conditions for and providing fit and right policy for CCS deployment. I think this is what we are pushing the government of Malaysia to have. At the moment, I think they are looking at it now, addressing it. I know the like of state of Sarawak, they have actually been ahead of the federal. It's something also we are pushing to drive these innovations in developing emerging CCS technology, because this CCS technology is not cheap. I just have to tell you, it's not cheap. To capture at source also is not cheap. So we need to do more projects so that we can actually reduce this cost. 83% of the projects now, all over the world, is all with some help from the government. It's either through financing, funding, cheap financing, funding, grant. So I think that they are about 83% of the project now. But we hope that more projects will take off so that the cost actually can compress more. So I think that is the drive, and we believe that this is where providing creative funding and financing scheme will support also the deployment, and also developing new talent. Yesterday, I think Cik Mazwi mentioned about for Petronas we have the geology and the engineers, the reservoir engineer looking at the subsurface. Yes, I think we will look at the same, but we just need to tweak a bit, because I think now we are looking at different things. We are not looking at oil and gas, we are looking at CO2. The mindset so have to slightly change, because so when we look at this, it's also towards across the industry, and developing talent is so important. I think also Malaysia, with all the opportunity to be offered to the region and to the global, I think Malaysia should tap all this global fund which is available outside. It will help Malaysia to start at deploying more CCS in the country. I have to look what my last point. My last point is that for Malaysia, we don't need to reinvent, start from scratch. We can actually start from learning from the best practices of others, the do's and don'ts, and we should amend to fit Malaysia and also the region. I think that is what it did for us. So for Petronas also, we can't do this alone. We are doing with many collaborators. We do require help, and collaborators, when we say it, we are not just playing with the oil and gas companies. We even have emitters. We also have a green solution company that also work with us. So we are looking at end-to-end. It's not just about storage. We are looking at also the capture, the transportation, because having storage without this also it doesn't work. So you need to do everything to be ready at the same time. So I hope that sharing is give you some awareness about the CCS, and you will hear from the other experts on the details of CCS and how safe it is. So thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señor. I had the pleasure of watching him playing soccer many years ago. I thought he could be our very own Lionel Messi for Malaysia, but he decided to join Petronas, unfortunately. But I'm pretty sure he will make us proud by solving our carbon problems now. Let's move on. Our next speaker, sitting next to me, is Dr. Tomomi Yamada. He's from JPEX. He'll be speaking to us on the technical aspect of CCS. He's a Vice President of Overseas Business 2, Advisor to President of Technical Division. Put it this way, if you Google his name, you will see plenty of his technical writing. That will be very useful. I encourage that. He has even received a distinguished award from SPE on this particular. So he's the expert. He'll be discussing the technology development of CO2 storage and sharing the implementation of CCS project by JPEX. So, Dr. Yamada, susumi kudasai.
inviting me to this important session. Now let me talk about the technical aspect of CCS, CCUS, focusing on the geological storage. The key question is how we can ensure safe CO2 storage over hundreds of years. Okay, the brief answer is that basically we can do that using technologies that have been already established in oil and gas in the E&P industry. This is a cartoon of geological CO2 storage. Tide formation works as here. Yeah, tide formation works as a topsy and forms a geological container. Injected CO2 migrates upward and accumulates underneath the sea. Such geological storage sites are identified just like what is done in oil and gas exploration. CO2 injection is the same operation as CO2 enhanced oil recovery. Even the CO2 reproduction tracks the same practice as what is done in underground gas storage. Now, the monitoring of such geological containment is in terms of both geomechanics and fluid dynamics, employs the technologies again developed in these E&P activities. With such background, I'll answer some FAQs. First one is how to ensure integrity of CO2 storage. High-level answer is safe injection operation and its monitoring. Okay. Careful injection operation assures seal integrity of caprock and wellbores and control the CO2 plume evolution. Caprock integrity is ensured by limiting the injection pressure below such level where the formation may break down or CO2 may permeate through it. Both of such limits can be estimated in advance. Cement status and the quality of all existing and even plugged wells are strictly investigated so that those wellbores never become CO2 pathway. A well-designed perforation program will keep a CO2 plume away from active fault, spill point, or even concession boundaries while maximizing the storage volume. Then such CO2 containment is validated by monitoring storage conditions, geomechanical events, and CO2 plume evolution using monitoring well observation wells and a variety of seismic sensing technology represented here. Another FAQ will be on the environmental monitoring. What are the long-term impact on soil and environment due to storing CO2? A good example has been reported in Tomakomai CCS demonstration project conducted by Japan CCS Corporation Limited, in which JAPEX is a leading shareholder and played some key roles in its operations. Okay. It is the first CCS project in Japan, successfully stored approximately 300,000 tons of CO2 over 3.5 years from 2016 to 2019. It injected CO2 from onshore wellhead to offshore aquifer, hence established the monitoring practice of the marine environment. Seasonal sampling and analysis of the seawater and the sediment confirmed the chemical properties of seawater and the situation of marine organisms, indicated no major trends deviating from those of the baseline surveys. As for the CO2 containment, the relations between the CO2 partial pressure versus dissolved oxygen in the seawater was monitored. Although the baseline survey themselves were affected by some seasonal variation, phenomena indicating CO2 leakage or the risk thereof were not confirmed. This project is currently in the 4th year of post-injection monitoring. No negative impact to the environment has been reported to date. Okay. Still, there is certain room for further technology development. People assume only CO2 capture and transportation as such fronts, but there is a major subject also in the storage segment, which is the storage factor here. Okay. Storage factor is the fraction of power volume actually accessed by the injected CO2 before the CO2 plume spills out. Storage factor is typically low for saline aquifer in flat heterogeneous formation because gas displaces water with different density and viscosity. However, if the extremely fine bubbles of CO2 dispersed in water are injected, now the displacement is water by water, hence those issues are gone. We predict this method could improve the storage factor by a few times. It implies that the storage capacity of a few 2 or 3 CCS sites could be achieved by only one CCS site and the corresponding investment. If we further take advantage of CO2 bubbles as fine bubbles, we could even sink CO2 bubbles in the formation until the CO2 is permanently fixed by some well-known mechanisms. This could relax the top seal requirement, hence we could do CCS anywhere so long as there is porous medium. Actually, this is one of our active research front. Okay. A number of CCS study projects have been announced in Malaysia, one of which is Bintu CCS, jointly studied by Petronas and 3 Japanese companies, JGC, K-Line, and JAPEX. The ambition is to decarbonize the Bintu energy complex and to build a CCS hub that can store CO2 even coming from outside Malaysia. We will input the presented technologies to establish technically and commercially viable CCS project, which shall involve some study on the institutional arrangement as well. Successful CCS project will also bring some CO2 containing new gas fields on stream, which will contribute to the energy security of the entire Asia, in addition to CO2 emission reduction. Thank you.
Next, we will be listening to a presentation from our regional thought leader in planning and policy making of carbon emission reduction, Professor Ho Hyang Kui. He's the lead technologist for National Climate Change Secretariat Strategy Group of the Prime Minister Office in Singapore. Today, he is sharing some insights on low carbon technology, including CCUS in Singapore, and also the policy and priority of the implementation of the project. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Ho.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to share with you what Singapore is trying to do in this area of looking at the use of carbon capture and storage. We actually usually talk about it as CCUS, which includes also the possibility of utilization of carbon dioxide. and that expands the scope a little bit, but there are still many things that are common to the things that the previous panelists have spoken about, and I will try to cover what Singapore is interested in doing in this area. Okay, the first slide I wanted to show you was a summary of Singapore's low emission development strategy. Some of you may know that under the Paris Agreement, countries that are signatory to the agreement are supposed to develop a long-term low emission development strategy that will be, you can say, aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is to achieve 1.5 degrees C warming, and also make sure that this can be done in a way that the world promotes development at the same time. So in this case, Singapore has now said that we will achieve, or we will try to achieve, net zero emissions by or around mid-century. Now this is already an updated version of a previous target that we set. Now we are talking about by 2050 or so, we will try to achieve net zero. I mean, Malaysians here know that your close neighbor Singapore has no resources actually on its own. For us to try to achieve net zero is actually much more difficult, I think, than many of our countries in the region. Nevertheless, we are going to give it a good try, and I believe that with the technologies that are now being developed, and also more importantly perhaps with the collaborations and internationally and regionally with the countries around us, I think we can achieve this target that I think the world needs to have in order to achieve decarbonization. So we are not talking about using advanced low carbon technologies, of which CCS or CCUS is one of them. We are talking about trying to use hydrogen, low carbon hydrogen. We are aggressively pursuing renewable energy or electricity imports. All the way from Australia even, they are talking to us to try to develop projects that can bring renewable electricity to Singapore. So what I'm trying to say is that we are quite serious about this. We know that initially the cost will be quite high, but we are prepared to go ahead and try to look into this very seriously and deeply, and as I said, with the collaboration of our neighbors and the region, we think that we can achieve it. Just a background to why CCS or CCUS can be important for Singapore. If you look at our emissions, the power and industry sector, you can see on the left where it shows primary emissions, that means the direct emissions. It comes from power and industry. 80% or more of our direct emissions come from industry and the power sector. Of course, the power sector serves many other sectors, including industry, transport, buildings, commercial buildings as well as residential buildings. So they contribute to all the other economic sectors of the country. But all these two main sectors of power industry need to be dealt with seriously if we are to achieve net zero. And because they are from what we call stationary point sources, CCUS solutions are potentially cost competitive for removing such emissions. And I'm glad that earlier panelists have already described the technologies, and we believe also that such technologies can be applied in Singapore. Of course, for the capture part, we can do it domestically. After that, we've got to really work with collaborators and partners in the region to achieve what we call transboundary projects that will involve shipping our CO2 somewhere else for it to be either stored or perhaps in the future maybe even utilized in some way. When we were looking at CCS and CCUS, it is really a very broad area, and you can see from this figure that it covers so many things. Some of them are much more mature than others. I think you know that there are existing projects for CCS and also enhanced oil recovery and so on. But we were also looking at the newer things that could promote what we call carbon circularity. With the hope that in the future, CO2 is not just treated as a waste. It is actually a kind of a feedstock that can be used to produce other useful products. Now that is very challenging because most of you know CO2 is almost a dead molecule. You know, he has done his job, he's very tired. You know, if you want to make it do something better like producing fuels and chemicals with it, it's going to be extremely challenging. Now, having said that, it is an area, a very active area in research and development to use renewable energy, electricity, renewable hydrogen to actually upgrade CO2 into useful fuels and chemicals. In the meantime, we are quite serious also on mineralization, which is a slightly technically more easy to achieve because carbonates are of a lower energy level than even CO2. So potentially, with a little bit of energy to start the process, you can actually turn CO2 into useful aggregates that could be used in the construction sector, for example. Now, these are more on the CCU part, but the CCS part is still very important for us. This is where, for the next maybe 10, 20, 30 years, will be the main needle mover for Singapore to try to use as far as CCUS is concerned. So the storage after the capture, of course, in between the transport, you know, and so on, it's also very challenging, but we're going to try to tackle all that. So what we are trying to do now is to advance next generation technology for capture, which is the first part of the whole process. In our case, a lot of emissions are very low concentration. By low concentration, we mean lower than around 3 to 5%. That's because with the help of Malaysia, we are actually using natural gas for a lot of our power generation. Now that is low emissions coming out of the power plants. So carbon capture, more needs to be done to reduce the energy use and the cost of capturing carbon, especially from lower concentration emissions. In the future, the world is even talking about negative emission technologies, not just capturing from fossil emissions, but capturing atmospheric emissions, capturing biogenic emissions. These are emissions that, you know, we can actually result in net negative emissions. And that is an important aspect, I think, of CCS as well. It has the potential to allow us to reduce even into the negative zone of CO2 reduction. Now, carbon utilization is still a lot of R&D needed, and we'll continue to do that. And then, as I mentioned, exploring all the partnerships and collaborations that we need to achieve transboundary projects on CCS. So for Singapore, this is a summary of what we are trying to do. I mentioned R&D, and we'll continue to do that. Recently, we awarded project funding for $55 million worth of projects in both CCUS and low carbon hydrogen. Looking at new technologies, some of these are to help us directly because of our circumstances. Some of it we think are also useful for the rest of the world to work together with us to enhance the viability of these technologies. One area which perhaps I should mention is this area of process engineering, and related to that is the issue of techno-economic assessment and life cycle assessment. Now, some of you may have heard that people are quite critical, some people are quite critical of CCS. They say it's just a way for the fossil fuel industry to continue to produce and use fossil fuels. Now, that is true to some extent, but having said that, we do not have full understanding yet, and some of the information or misinformation that is coming out is something that we also got to deal with. You know, when people write that, you know, there is no effective emission reduction from CCS, a lot of it is not substantiated by the facts and the scientific data. So I also want you to join us in actually assessing some of the issues around both the techno-economics and the life cycle of projects involving carbon capture and storage. CCUS is now recognized, the second point here, for us as part of our aspirations for sustainable Jurong Island, which is our main island for the chemical industry, producing maybe 60% of our emissions just on the industrial area. The EDB, the Economic Development Board in Singapore, has published a document that points towards the use of CCUS as an important way to reduce emissions for Jurong Island in the future. We are now talking to both the private sector and with governments on possible collaborations on regional CCUS and transboundary projects. We were glad when Petronas engaged us on this, and we are now we'll continue talking to them both directly and also through our companies and private sector. And also we need to start talking also to the Malaysian government, and that is what we are going to try to do as well, as we have done so for other countries such as Australia, Indonesia, Brunei. These are countries that we are already officially engaging with in the area of CCUS. And then private sector continues its work. Our oil majors know that they have a big challenge ahead of them if they want to operate in Singapore. They have come out in public to say that they want to actively participate in carbon capture related efforts for the region. And again, I'm sure Malaysia and Indonesia will be countries that will be part of these efforts as well. And we have other efforts that are listed here. They're all in the public domain. You can Google them and look at what some of the things we are trying to do. So building on this, Singapore will continue to pursue technology development, R&D innovations, and foster private-public partnerships for this important area. And I want to thank people here who have contributed to the beginning of these efforts for Singapore to enable this to be considered and developed into a real mitigation option for us. Thank you very much.
Professor Ho. Rounding out our today's deep dive session, we will have the pleasure of listening to another leading specialist in net zero emission, Mr. Michael Harrison of Ashes. He's a senior partner, energy infrastructure Ashes. Really wide experience. He's done that. He's been everywhere. After reading the data, I think we simply cannot wait to listen to his views and insights. So, Mr. Harrison, please go ahead. Please enlighten us and share your wisdom, please.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try and keep this shorter than 10 minutes, and so there'll be time for questions. I'm going to spend probably about 8 minutes, hopefully, just looking at key policy settings in the United Kingdom at the moment. Before I do that, I just want to touch on some news that arose yesterday, which is the first transboundary transaction was agreed in Europe between Equinor, Shell and Total Energies, transacted with Yara in relation to the storage of 800,000 metric tons of CO2 a year to be transported from the Netherlands into Norway. That's a world first, but it also shows that this isn't theoretical, this is actually happening. So in the context of the UK, while the UK has been contemplating CCS for a number of years, it's only really in the last 2 years or so, or 3 years or so, that the UK has started to make progress. That progress is a result of what was called the 10-point plan for the Green Industrial Revolution. Point 8 of that 10-point plan stated the UK's ambition to capture up to 10 million metric tons of CO2 a year by 2030, and to invest £1 billion to support the establishment of what are called 4 industrial clusters around England and also in Scotland and Wales. Of those 4 clusters, 2 are to be established by the mid-2020s, with all 4 to be established by 2030. As I say, together they'll capture 10 million metric tons of CO2 by 2030. In relation to the £1 billion available, that's going to be sourced entirely from government funding in a thing called the CCS Infrastructure Fund. And that's going to provide industry with certainty to deploy CCUS at pace and at scale. Critical points. As you'll see, the UK government is taking an active role in the development of CCUS in the UK. The government is seeking to encourage demand for CO2 storage, and also the supply of sufficient CO2 to allow that CO2 storage to allow that to happen. In May of this year, the Energy Security Bill was introduced in the UK. It addresses the British energy security strategy, at least in part responding to the events in the Ukraine, but also, and more importantly for our purposes, it sets out the means to implement the 10-point plan for the green industrial revolution. The stated focus of the Energy Security Bill is to focus on 10 key elements. Critically, for our purposes, the introduction of state-of-the-art business models for carbon capture and storage. Stated state-of-the-art business models relate to all elements of carbon capture and storage, the capture, which we've talked about already, or heard about already, and transportation and storage. And I'll come back to those models on my final slide. These initiatives follow a fair amount of activity in the UK. Critically, late last year, the first two of the four industrial clusters were chosen by the UK government. The East Coast cluster, as noted up there, and the HyNet Northwest cluster. These are industrial areas which give rise to CO2, but also have an affinity to produce hydrogen. Critical to any CCS project is permitting. The UK has had permitting regulations in place for 12 years now, but the critical thing in the UK is there aren't many carbon storage licenses have been issued because there hasn't been a framework to encourage the underlying economics of carbon capture and storage projects to develop. At the moment, there are 6 carbon storage licenses in the UK, all of them pretty much relating to the carbon clusters that are detailed on the map. As the UK moves forward to the award of the 3rd and 4th industrial sector clusters, there's going to be more interest in obtaining carbon storage licenses. Oops. Oops. In anticipation of an increased demand for carbon storage licenses, in June of this year, the UK government, through the North Sea Transition Authority, announced the first carbon storage licensing round. Previously, licenses had been awarded on an ad hoc basis. The government is now going through a formal process in relation to 13 sites around the UK into which CO2 can be stored. The North Sea Transition Authority noted that this first carbon storage licensing round was in response to unprecedented levels of interest from companies eager to enter the market for carbon storage. Critical thing, and I think it was mentioned by the first speaker, unless we get moving on carbon storage, it's becoming increasingly clear that we're not going to achieve our objectives of getting to net zero by 2050. And I think over the last 6 months or so, there's been increased understanding of that requirement. A couple of minutes ago, I just mentioned looking at business models. Whilst the UK has had the ability to license carbon storage since 2010, it's taken time to get to a position where the thinking has been developed to make that economic. At the moment, the UK is looking at 2 basic business models: point of capture of CO2 and also transportation and storage. And if you think about the first presentation we had this morning, that's the whole of the value chain for CO2. So what's the UK government doing? Well, it's proposing that at point of capture, i.e. the point of emission and then immediate capture, there's going to be a business model whereby the emitter of CO2 is or contracts with the government for a thing called a contract for differences. Fundamental point there is that there's a business as usual cost for the emitter, and then there's a cost of capturing and then sending to store. The UK government is saying we'll put in place contracts for differences so that you as the emitter are not out of pocket. It's a long established methodology in the UK. Then in relation to transportation and storage, the business model is to provide a licensing regime for what are called TNSCos, transport and storage companies. And the principle there is that the government wants to maximise CO2 storage. So what the government's going to do is to introduce a licensing regime under which CO2 can be transported and stored under that license regime. It'll be unlawful to transport and store unless you've got this license. And here's the rub. You won't get a license unless you've got a thing called a CCS network code. And the CCS network code is a document that allows open access to any emitter. So any emitter can say, I would like to go and transport and store my CO2 in that location. And if you're a TNS co, you must contract on stated terms and critically at a regulated price. So the UK government is not leaving it to the private sector to charge the maximum that it could. The UK government's trying to get to a position where it's maximising the amount of CO2 that goes to store. So from that very quick canter through, because I'm conscious of time, it's apparent that the role of the government in the UK has been instrumental to the development of what is now becoming a highly prospective industry. Thank you for your time.
Cheers, mate. We really appreciate that. Now, when we're having fun, normally time really flies. So let's go to the audience. Please do raise your hand if you have any question. First, please state your name, your organization, and to whom you're going to ask the question to, except myself. Please, who has the first question? Anyone? Yes. We have the first question to Jane in front.
Thank you. I'm Jane from Petronas. My question is to the gentleman from the UK, Mr. Everson. Sir, in terms of policy, what is needed to drive the policy change? Will they have to come from the private sector, or will it be beyond that? Thank you.
Is this on? Is this working? Yeah. How long have we got? The critical thing at the moment is that, as I think was said, over 80% of all the CCS projects globally require some level of government assistance. They don't make economic sense of themselves, and if you leave it to the private sector to develop CCUS projects, they will not do so, unless possibly in certain parts of the United States where there's very high CO2 emissions. So what you need is a very clear basis for government, and so critically what you need, and it won't be the same in every country, but in a developed country, you need a price on carbon. Whether that price on carbon is a carbon tax or whether it's an emissions trading scheme, you need both of those concepts. Why? Because that basically forces the emitters of CO2 to come up with a solution, most obviously to reduce their CO2 emissions. One solution that they may choose to adopt is CO2 storage. So you need that framework in an ideal world. If you can't get to a point where you have a price on carbon, whether by a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme or both, then you really need to have government to provide parameters for the development of hydrogen hubs and carbon clusters. And so that's what is happening in